The wind howls across the high plains of Tibet, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the distant cries of warriors locked in combat. Armored horsemen charge through swirling dust, their yak-hide shields glinting under the harsh sun as arrows whistle through the air like vengeful spirits. This was no ordinary battle. This was warfare mastered by the ancient Tibetans, a people who turned their mountains into fortresses and their traditions into weapons. But what truly set them apart were the secret's 30 brutal, brilliant tactics that made their armies nearly unstoppable. For centuries, these techniques were whispered only among warriors, passed down in guarded rituals, then lost to time as empires crumbled. Today, we pry open the vault of history to reveal what made Tibetan warfare so terrifyingly effective. From arrows that screamed like demons to illusions that made entire armies vanish, these were not just tricks of war, they were psychological masterpieces forged in the thin air of the Himalayas. Why did neighboring kingdoms flee at the sight of Tibetan prayer flags? How did soldiers survive battles where the terrain itself was weaponized? And perhaps most chilling, could these ancient secrets still work on a modern battlefield? The answers lie buried in ice and legend, waiting for those brave enough to learn them. Stay with us as we uncover all 30 secrets one by one and witness how a kingdom defended by the roof of the world became history's most enigmatic military power. Your understanding of ancient warfare is about to change forever. But before the battle cries and clashing steel, the Tibetans had another weapon, one that struck fear into enemy hearts before a single arrow even found its mark. Picture this, a silent battlefield, the air thick with tension, when suddenly the sky itself seems to scream. This was the power of the whispering arrows. Tibetan archers didn't just shoot to kill, they shot to terrify. Each arrow was meticulously crafted with hollowed-out tips or carved bone attachments designed to create an unnatural, high-pitched whistle as it flew. Imagine standing in formation, hearing dozens, no, hundreds of these arrows shrieking toward you like vengeful spirits. The sound alone was enough to shatter morale before the first drop of blood was spilled. The psychological impact was devastating. Historical accounts describe enemy soldiers freezing in place, dropping their weapons, or even fleeing outright at the sound. In one legendary clash, a Tibetan force of just 500 archers routed an army 3 times their size simply by unleashing a single volley of these sonic nightmares. The opposing troops, convinced they were under attack by demons, broke ranks and scattered into the mountains. But how were these arrows made? Skilled Tibetan fletchers used a combination of materials to achieve the eerie effect. Some arrows had perforated tips, while others used hollowed-out animal bones or bamboo chambers that acted like primitive whistles. The precise angle of the holes and the speed of the arrow's flight determined the pitch and volume of the sound. It wasn't just noise, it was an instrument of terror fine-tuned to exploit primal fears. And here's the chilling part. Modern experiments have recreated these arrows, and the sound they produce is genuinely unsettling. Researchers noted how the whistle seems to mimic human screams, tapping into an instinctive fear hardwired into our brains. The Tibetans didn't just invent a weapon, they weaponized the human mind itself. But the whispering arrows were just the beginning. As we'll see next, the Tibetans didn't just manipulate sound, they mastered the very art of deception, making entire armies vanish into thin air. Now, imagine an army that could vanish before your eyes only to reappear where you least expected it. The Tibetans didn't just rely on terrifying sounds to win battles. They manipulated sight itself, turning the harsh Himalayan landscape into a weapon of illusion. This was the art of Mirage Camouflage, where warriors became ghosts in the mountains. High-altitude sunlight and reflective surfaces were their allies. Tibetan fighters polished shields, armor, and even rocks to catch the light at precise angles, creating blinding flashes or false images. Some warriors draped themselves in mirrored cloth or wore helmets studded with polished metal fragments, scattering light to distort their silhouettes. But the real genius lay in how they used the terrain. Narrow passes and rocky outcrops became stages for deception. A small group of soldiers, strategically positioned, could mimic the movements of a much larger force by reflecting sunlight in coordinated patterns. Enemies would swear they saw hundreds of troops advancing over a ridge only to find empty air when they charged. One legendary account tells of a Tibetan outpost defending a critical mountain pass against an invading Tang dynasty force. Outnumbered 10-1, the defenders scattered polished stones across the cliffs and tied mirrored strips to yaks, driving the animals along hidden trails. As the sun rose, the entire mountainside seemed to shimmer with movement. The Tang commanders, convinced they were facing a vast army, ordered a retreat only to be ambushed days later by the real Tibetan force, which had silently circled behind them. Modern military historians compare these tactics to early forms of psychological warfare. The Tibetans exploited a universal human weakness, the brain's tendency to fill in gaps when faced with uncertainty. A flicker of light on a distant slope could become an advancing battalion in the eyes of a nervous scout. And in the thin air of the Himalayas, where shadows played tricks and mirages were common, fear did the rest. Yet the most chilling part, some techniques remain unexplained. Accounts describe entire Tibetan units seemingly disappearing into rock faces or snowdrifts, leaving enemies slashing at empty air. Scholars speculate they may have used natural mineral deposits or ice formations as living mirrors, but the exact methods died with the warriors who mastered them. From whispering arrows to vanishing acts, the Tibetans proved that the mind was the ultimate battlefield, but their arsenal of deception didn't stop there. Next, we'll uncover how they turned the humble yak into a weapon of war, one that could crush enemy lines without a single sword being drawn. Now, let's turn from illusions to something far more tangible, yet just as ingenious. Picture a warrior clad not in clanking metal, but in armor so light it barely slows them down, yet so tough it turns away arrows like a stone-deflecting rain. This was the power of Tibetan Yak-Hide Armor, a masterpiece of practicality forged by necessity in the high Himalayas. Unlike the heavy iron plates of European knights or the lamellar steel of Chinese armies, Tibetan warriors relied on layers of treated yak hide, meticulously crafted into flexible yet nearly indestructible protection. The process began with selecting the toughest hides from mature yaks, animals already adapted to the brutal mountain environment. These hides were then soaked in a secret mixture of oils, salts, and minerals, a recipe some historians believe included high-altitude plant extracts to toughen the leather without sacrificing flexibility. The result, armor that could be rolled up and carried easily over long marches, then unfurled to stop all but the most direct hits from arrows or blades. But the real brilliance lay in the layering. Thin sheets of hide were stacked and stitched together in overlapping patterns, often with wool or felt sandwiched between them. This created a cushioning effect, dispersing the force of blows. Tests with replica armor show that even at close range, arrows would lodge in the outer layers without piercing through to the skin. And because the armor was so light, weighing less than half of comparable metal designs, Tibetan soldiers could move swiftly across treacherous terrain, scaling cliffs or charging downhill with agility that stunned their enemies. One of the most striking accounts comes from an 8th century clash between Tibetan forces and the Tang dynasty's frontier troops. Tang records describe their arrows bouncing harmlessly off Tibetan warriors, who then closed the distance with terrifying speed. "They came upon us like snow leopards," one survivor wrote, "unhindered by our volleys, their bodies shielded by some sorcery of hide and wind." Modern experiments back this up. When researchers fired period-accurate arrows at reconstructed Yak-Hide armor, the arrows either stuck shallowly in the layers or shattered on impact, leaving the wearer unscathed. Yet the armor's advantages went beyond pure defense. In the thin air of the Himalayas, where every ounce of weight mattered, Tibetan soldiers could march farther and fight longer than opponents burdened by metal. The hides also provided insulation against biting cold, allowing warriors to endure night watches or high-altitude ambushes that would cripple less prepared armies. And because yaks were central to Tibetan life, the materials were readily available, unlike iron, which required scarce fuel and expertise to smelt in such rugged terrain. Perhaps the most fascinating detail, some sets of this armor were reversible, with one side dyed white for winter camouflage and the other left dark for rocky landscapes. This attention to adaptability encapsulates Tibetan warfare, turning limitations into strengths and humble materials into legendary tools of survival. From vanishing mirages to unstoppable Yak-Hide warriors, the Tibetans redefined what it meant to be prepared for battle, but their creativity didn't end there. Next, we'll reveal how they turned the very rivers of the Himalayas into deadly traps, using ice as both weapon and ally. Now, let's venture into one of Tibet's most ruthless battlefield innovations, where nature itself became a weapon. High in the Himalayas, where rivers freeze into ribbons of treacherous ice, Tibetan warriors mastered the art of turning these frozen pathways into death traps. Imagine an enemy army confident in their pursuit, only to find the ground beneath them cracking open like a cruel joke. This was the frozen river ambush, a tactic that played on the arrogance of invaders who underestimated both the land and the cunning of those who called it home. Tibetan commanders knew their terrain intimately. They understood which rivers froze unevenly, leaving thin patches concealed under a dusting of snow, and which stretches of ice could bear the weight of a single scout but collapse beneath a column of armored soldiers. When enemy forces chased Tibetan raiding parties, often a feigned retreat, they'd be lured onto these frozen kill zones. At a signal, hidden warriors would strike, not with arrows, but with tools designed to shatter the ice: iron-tipped poles, weighted ropes, even flaming projectiles to melt weak points. The results were as devastating as they were swift. Tang Dynasty chronicles describe entire cavalry units vanishing into freezing torrents, their heavy armor dragging them under before they could react. But the cruelty of this tactic went beyond drowning. Survivors stumbling onto solid ground found themselves stranded on slick ice, unable to charge or retreat without slipping. Tibetan warriors, wearing spiked footwear or wrapped in yak hide for traction, would pick them off with spears or bows while their enemies flailed like helpless prey. One account from a 9th century Tibetan scroll boasts of a battle where the river swallowed 300 horses in the time it takes to boil tea, leaving the surviving infantry to be harvested like barley in the first frost. The frozen river ambush wasn't just about brute force, it was psychological warfare. Enemy armies learned to fear crossing Himalayan rivers in winter, slowing their advances to test every step. Tibetan scouts would sometimes stampede yaks onto the ice ahead of pursuers, both testing its stability and seeding panic. And in a gruesome twist, there's evidence they deliberately leave corpses frozen into the ice as warnings, visible to future invaders. What made this tactic so effective was its simplicity. No complex machinery or rare materials were needed, just an intimate knowledge of the environment and the willingness to exploit it mercilessly. Modern glaciologists studying old battle sites have noted how Tibetan warriors likely used sound to gauge ice thickness, tapping ahead with spears to find weak spots before engaging. It was warfare stripped down to its most elemental: ice, gravity, and the hubris of those who thought the mountains could be conquered. From Yak-Hide armor to rivers turned against invaders, Tibetan warfare was a masterclass in adaptability. But next, we'll uncover an even more astonishing weapon, one that didn't just terrify enemies, but made them question the very skies above them. Now, let's turn our attention to a weapon that didn't strike with blades or arrows, but with sheer terror echoing across the mountains. Tibetan warriors didn't just fight their enemies, they invaded their minds, using sound as a weapon. Among their most fearsome tools were the thunder drums, colossal instruments that could shake the earth and shatter the nerves of even the bravest soldiers. These weren't ordinary war drums, crafted from the hollowed trunks of ancient juniper trees and stretched with the hides of yaks. They stood taller than a man and required multiple warriors to carry them into battle. When struck with bone mallets wrapped in wolf pelts, the drums produced a deep, resonant boom that rolled through the valleys like actual thunder. Historical accounts describe the sound as so overpowering that it could be heard miles away, long before an enemy army ever saw the Tibetan forces. And that was the point: to disorient, to confuse, and to make the enemy question whether they were facing mortal warriors or something far more supernatural. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine standing in a narrow mountain pass, hearing what sounds like a storm brewing just beyond the next ridge, only to realize the sky is clear. Then the drumming starts, growing louder, closer, but with no visible source. By the time the enemy realized it wasn't thunder, Tibetan cavalry and archers would already be moving into position, their movements masked by the relentless noise. Some Chinese chronicles even report soldiers fleeing in panic, believing the drums were the voices of angry mountain gods. But the thunder drums weren't just tools of war, they were sacred instruments deeply tied to Tibetan spiritual beliefs. In Bon and later Buddhist traditions, drums were used to commune with deities, to drive away evil spirits, and to mark rituals. Warriors believed the drums carried the blessings of protective deities, and before battle, monks would chant over them, infusing them with spiritual power. This dual role made them even more terrifying to outsiders, who saw them as both weapons and objects of divine wrath. The drums also served a tactical purpose beyond sheer intimidation. Their sound could synchronize troop movements across vast distances, acting as a battlefield communication system when visual signals were impossible. A series of rapid beats might signal an ambush, while a slow, steady rhythm could order a retreat. And because the sound echoed unpredictably in the mountains, enemies often couldn't pinpoint the drums' locations, leaving them vulnerable to attacks from unexpected directions. One famous example comes from a 7th century battle against Tang dynasty forces, where Tibetan drummers positioned themselves on high cliffs, creating the illusion of an army surrounding the Chinese from all sides. The resulting chaos allowed a smaller Tibetan force to rout a much larger enemy. Even today, some Himalayan herders claim to hear ghostly drum beats near old battlefields, a testament to the lasting legend of these instruments. From spiritual talismans to instruments of terror, the thunder drums show how Tibetan warfare blended the physical and the psychological. But as we'll see next, their mastery of the high-altitude environment gave them another edge, one that couldn't be countered with strength or numbers alone. Now, let's ascend into the thin air of the Himalayas, where Tibetan warriors turned the very mountains into their greatest ally. While other armies struggled to breathe at these heights, the Tibetans thrived thanks to a lifetime of brutal conditioning that gave them an edge no enemy could match. High-altitude warfare wasn't just a tactic for these warriors, it was their way of life. From childhood, Tibetan soldiers trained in regions where oxygen levels dropped to nearly half of what lowland armies were accustomed to. This harsh environment forced their bodies to adapt in extraordinary ways. Their lungs developed greater capacity, their blood carried oxygen more efficiently, and their muscles resisted fatigue far longer than those of invaders gasping for air. Imagine a battle where your enemy moves effortlessly across steep ridges, while your own troops collapse from exhaustion just trying to keep up. That was the reality Tibetan warriors engineered. Historical records from the Tang dynasty describe Chinese soldiers struggling to fight above 10,000 feet, their hands shaking, their vision blurring, while Tibetan forces attacked with relentless energy. One account tells of a Tibetan scout who ran over 50 miles in a single day across mountain passes to deliver a message, then returned to battle without rest. To lowland armies, such feats seemed superhuman, but they were the result of generations of physiological adaptation. Even today, modern studies confirm that Tibetans possess genetic mutations like the EPAS1 gene. that allow their bodies to function with far less oxygen than most people. But genetics alone didn't create these warriors. Their training was just as deliberate as it was harsh. Young recruits were sent on multi-day marches with minimal supplies, learning to endure freezing temperatures and scarce food. They practiced combat maneuvers on near-vertical slopes, building leg strength that let them charge uphill while weighted down with armor. Breathing exercises, similar to those used by monastic traditions, taught them to control their heart rates during battle, conserving energy for critical moments. And unlike lowland armies who relied on heavy supply lines, Tibetan warriors could live for weeks on handfuls of tsampa, roasted barley flour, making them nearly self-sufficient in the harshest terrain. The psychological toll on invaders was just as devastating as the physical one. Chinese chronicles describe soldiers gripped by altitude sickness, hallucinating from oxygen deprivation, or simply freezing to death in sudden storms the Tibetans predicted hours in advance. In one infamous 8th century campaign, a Tang general lost 2/3 of his army to the cold and thin air before even encountering the enemy. By contrast, Tibetan warriors used the landscape as a weapon, luring foes into high passes where fatigue and disorientation made them easy targets. This conditioning also allowed Tibetans to wage a form of warfare impossible for others, the prolonged high-altitude siege. While most armies would starve or retreat within weeks, Tibetan forces could hold strategic peaks for months, waiting for enemies to weaken. Some fortresses, like the cliffside stronghold of Gyantse, were virtually unconquerable precisely because no lowland army could sustain itself long enough to storm them. The legacy of this training endures. Modern mountaineers still study Tibetan techniques to acclimatize, and elite military units worldwide train at altitude to replicate even a fraction of their stamina. But for ancient Tibetan warriors, this wasn't just a strategy, it was home. And as we'll see next, their mastery of the mountains didn't stop at endurance. They also learned to move through them like ghosts, vanishing and reappearing with terrifying precision. Now, let's step into the realm of shadows, where Tibetan horsemen mastered the art of becoming phantoms on the battlefield. These riders didn't just charge at their enemies, they toyed with them, appearing and vanishing like apparitions in the thin mountain air. To opposing armies, it was as if the very landscape conspired with the Tibetans, turning every dust storm and narrow pass into a stage for psychological terror. The phantom horsemen were no ordinary cavalry. They rode smaller, hardier Himalayan horses, bred for agility on steep slopes where larger warhorses would struggle. These animals could navigate near sheer cliffs with uncanny balance, allowing riders to strike from angles enemies never anticipated. But their true weapon wasn't speed or strength, it was deception. A unit of 50 horsemen could seem like 200 by splitting into smaller groups, riding in overlapping circles to kick up dust, then regrouping silently behind ridges. Chinese chronicles speak of entire battalions fleeing in panic when what they thought was the vanguard of a massive army turned out to be just a handful of riders exploiting echoes and mirages. Timing was everything. The horsemen waited for weather to become their ally, attacking when winds whipped grit into the air or when the low sun cast long, disorienting shadows across the valleys. In one clash near the Tsangpo River, Tibetan riders used a sudden sandstorm to mask their movements, encircling a Tang patrol that never saw them coming until spears pierced their formation from all sides at once. Survivors later swore the attackers had emerged from the storm itself, their faces wrapped in scarves dyed to match the swirling dust. Their tactics relied on intimate knowledge of the land. Hidden trails known only to local herders allowed them to bypass enemy positions entirely, while strategically placed rock piles or stripped tree branches served as silent markers for rendezvous points. Some passes had natural echo chambers where a few shouts could mimic the sounds of an approaching horde, a trick used to delay pursuing forces while the real army slipped away. Perhaps most chilling was their disappearance. After a raid, the horsemen would scatter into narrow gorges too tight for organized pursuit, or ford rivers at hidden shallow points their enemies couldn't find. To frustrated commanders, it seemed the Tibetans melted into the mountains only to reappear days later 100 miles away, striking a supply depot no one thought was vulnerable. This wasn't just mobility, it was theater. The Tibetans understood that uncertainty could paralyze an enemy better than any blade. When the Mongols invaded in the 13th century, they found themselves chasing rumors instead of armies, wasting weeks searching valleys the phantom horsemen had already abandoned. By the time the invaders realized they'd been outmaneuvered, the Tibetans were burning their supply trains far behind Mongol lines. Even their attire played a role. Unlike the colorful banners of lowland armies, Tibetan riders wore muted browns and grays that blurred into rock faces, with horse blankets dyed to match seasonal foliage. Some tied yak hair tufts to their gear to soften the clatter of weapons, making night approaches nearly silent. The effect was so unnerving that Tang diplomats once demanded Tibetan ambassadors explain how their horsemen walked through walls, convinced there was sorcery at work. The legacy of these tactics endures in modern guerrilla warfare manuals, but for the phantom horsemen, this was simply how war was waged in a land where the mountains themselves were the greatest ally. And as we'll soon see, their mastery of deception extended far beyond the saddle, into the very rituals that made enemies question whether they were fighting mortals or something far more ancient. Now, let's peel back another layer of Tibetan warfare, one that blurred the line between strategy and what many would call outright treachery. The poisoned wind was a tactic so feared that even seasoned armies hesitated to advance into certain valleys, knowing the very air could turn against them. The Tibetans harnessed their deep knowledge of Himalayan botany to weaponize nature itself. They would gather toxic plants like aconite, known locally as wolf's bane, and blue hellebore, crushing their roots into fine powders. Mixed with combustible materials, these poisons were loaded into hollowed-out yak horns or clay pots, then ignited atop strategic ridges. Mountain winds did the rest, carrying clouds of debilitating vapor down onto unsuspecting enemies below. Chinese records describe entire battalions collapsing with symptoms ranging from violent nausea to paralysis. Some victims reportedly drowned face down in shallow streams, too weak to lift their heads. But the poisoned wind wasn't just about flora. In the highland salt flats, warriors burned sulfur-rich minerals to create choking fumes that mimicked volcanic gases. At the Battle of Dangtong Plateau in the 8th century, Tibetan forces used this method to disorient a Tang dynasty column, forcing them to abandon their formation just as arrow volleys rained from cliffs above. The effectiveness hinged on precision wind patterns were studied for generations, with certain passes like the Kyechu Valley becoming infamous death funnels where toxins lingered longest. The ethics of such tactics sparked debate even in ancient times. While Tibetan texts justified it as exploiting the land's natural defenses, opponents branded it as cowardice. A surviving Tang officer's diary rails against those who murder without crossing blades, claiming poisoned winds violated unspoken rules of honorable combat. Yet pragmatism often overrode scruples when facing numerically superior foes. Tibetans saw it as leveling the field. Interestingly, the poisoned wind's psychological impact sometimes outweighed its physical effects. After a single well-documented incident, superstitious invaders began tying damp scarves over their faces, believing the Tibetans could summon miasmas of angry mountain spirits. Some armies even postponed campaigns during certain seasons, fearing the wind itself had been cursed. Modern scholars still question how lethal these tactics truly were. While toxins like aconite could be deadly in concentrated doses, most battlefield use likely caused temporary incapacitation rather than mass fatalities, a way to soften enemies for conventional attacks. Recent soil studies near ancient battlegrounds show elevated levels of heavy metals like arsenic, suggesting some toxins may have accumulated over time from repeated use. What's undeniable is the poisoned wind's legacy in asymmetric warfare. From Byzantine Greek fire to World War I's mustard gas, the principle of turning environment into weapon persists. Yet perhaps the most unsettling lesson lies in how effortlessly the Tibetans blurred the boundaries between martial ingenuity and the darker arts of war, a reminder that in the high Himalayas, even the air could be conscripted to fight. Now, let's step into one of the most chilling psychological gambits of Tibetan warfare, a tactic that turned reverence into a weapon. The sky burial deception preyed on an enemy's respect for the dead, twisting sacred traditions into lethal traps. In Tibetan culture, sky burials, where bodies are left on mountaintops for vultures to carry the soul to heaven, are among the most solemn rites. Warriors exploited this by staging fake ceremonies near strategic passes, knowing outsiders would either pause to observe or investigate out of morbid curiosity. Historical accounts tell of Tang scouts discovering what appeared to be a funeral procession, robed figures chanting, incense swirling, and what seemed like a wrapped corpse laid upon rocks. But when the enemy drew closer, the mourners would vanish and the corpse would erupt with hidden archers or trigger avalanches of pre-loosened boulders. The ruse worked because it exploited two universal instincts: cultural fascination and tactical caution. Invaders often documented Tibetan death rites with a mix of horror and awe, making sky burials prime bait. At the Battle of Tsuofu Valley, a Tibetan commander named Lobsang Gyatso used decoy burials to lure a Tang cavalry unit into a narrow gorge. The body was actually a bundle of smoldering horse dung and sulfur. When disturbed, it released blinding smoke, masking the descent of rock throwers from cliffs above. But the deception's brilliance lay in its adaptability. In some cases, warriors would stage multiple fake burials over days, conditioning enemies to ignore what seemed like routine ceremonies only to hide troops amid a genuine one. Other times, they'd leave abandoned burial tools, ritual knives, prayer flags, laced with contact poisons. A Mongol chronicle recounts how Kublai Khan's scouts lost an entire unit after handling a sacred bell left at a staged site. Its interior was coated with crushed blister beetles. Ethically, this tactic crossed lines even by Tibetan standards. While poisoned winds could be framed as environmental warfare, hijacking funeral rites violated their own spiritual laws. Some monastic texts condemn commanders who used it, warning that deceit upon the dead invites wrath upon the living. Yet desperation often overruled doctrine when facing annihilation. Even taboos became tools. Modern historians debate how frequently the ruse succeeded. While Chinese and Mongol records mention it often, Tibetan sources rarely admit to it, suggesting it was either exaggerated by enemies or considered shameful. Archaeological finds support its existence. At Gurlam Pass, researchers uncovered a stone platform with hidden compartments beneath, ideal for concealing ambushers. The sky burial deception's legacy endures in unconventional warfare manuals. From Vietnam's booby-trapped shrines to Afghan insurgents' misuse of funeral processions, the tactic proves that exploiting an enemy's respect can be deadlier than targeting their fear. It's a dark lesson in how easily the sacred can be weaponized, and why, in war, even reverence must sometimes be viewed with suspicion. Now, let's turn our attention to something far more hypnotic, a secret that didn't just move armies, but synchronized them like a single, unstoppable force. The power of mantra warfare wasn't in blades or arrows, but in the rhythm of voices chanting as one. Tibetan warriors didn't just fight, they sang their way into battle. Commanders used sacred mantras, repeated over and over, to create an eerie cadence that united soldiers' movements and sharpened their focus to a razor's edge. Imagine hundreds of warriors advancing in perfect lockstep, their breaths and footsteps timed to the pulse of deep, resonant chants. This wasn't mere tradition, it was psychological engineering. Historical scrolls from the Yarlung dynasty describe how specific mantras, like the famed Om Mani Padme Hum, were adapted for war. The syllables' vibrations were believed to summon divine protection, but their real magic lay in physiology. The steady repetition slowed heart rates, steadied hands, and induced a trance-like state where fatigue and fear melted away. At the Siege of Jiangxi, defenders chanted for hours without breaking formation, weathering wave after wave of assaults. Mongol invaders later wrote of the ghostly hum that seemed to make Tibetan arrows fly straighter and their shields impossibly unwavering. Modern science backs this ancient tactic. Studies on rhythmic combat training, like those conducted by the Norwegian Military Academy, show that synchronized chanting or drumming boosts unit cohesion and pain tolerance. The brain releases endorphins in response to rhythmic stimuli, creating a natural high that dulls discomfort and heightens alertness. Elite forces from the Gurkhas to the French Foreign Legion now incorporate similar techniques, proof that the Tibetans were centuries ahead in understanding the battlefield mind. But mantra warfare wasn't just about endurance, it was also a tool of deception. During night raids, small squads would chant softly from multiple directions, making a handful of warriors sound like an approaching legion. At the Battle of Chamdo, a Tibetan outpost surrounded by king forces used overlapping chants to mimic reinforcements, buying time for a hidden cavalry to flank the enemy. The king commander reportedly fled, convinced he was facing an army of singing spirits. Yet the practice had its risks. Over-reliance on mantras could backfire if the rhythm broke. A Ming Dynasty chronicle recounts how Tibetan lines collapsed at Durgae when a spy mimicked their chant off-beat, disrupting their focus. And not all soldiers could handle the trance state. Some accounts mention warriors collapsing from overexertion, too entranced to notice their own wounds. Today, echoes of mantra warfare live on in unexpected places. Police riot units use rhythmic calls to maintain formation, and Olympic rowers sync their strokes to coxswain's chants. Even therapists employ mantra-like repetition to treat PTSD, a haunting reminder that the Tibetans' secret weapon was really about harnessing the deepest layers of human psychology. Their chants didn't just summon gods, they unlocked something far more powerful, the untapped potential of a mind united in purpose. Now, shifting from the unseen power of sound to the tangible mastery of metal, we uncover another secret that gave Tibetan warriors an edge, literally. The art of ice blade forging was no mere blacksmith's craft. It was a marriage of high-altitude ingenuity and nature's brutal elements. Tibetan smiths didn't just work with metal, they conspired with the mountains themselves. Unlike lowland swordsmiths who relied on rivers for quenching, these craftsmen used glaciers and ice fields to temper their blades. The result, weapons that thrived in the cold, holding their razor edge far longer than conventional steel. Imagine a sword that grew stronger as winter deepened, a nightmare for enemies shivering in their boots. The secret began with the metal. Tibet's high-altitude mines yielded iron ore laced with trace tungsten and vanadium, elements modern metallurgists now prize for durability. Smiths would fold and hammer these ores atop wind-scoured plateaus, where thin air reduced impurities in the metal, but the real magic happened during tempering. Instead of plunging red-hot blades into water, they embedded them in packed ice or glacial runoff. This slower, controlled cooling created a finer grain structure, preventing the brittleness that plagued hastily quenched weapons. A Ming Dynasty trade log even notes how Tibetan daggers traded to Nepal would not dull even after cleaving bone, forcing rival smiths to hike into the Himalayas to steal techniques. One battle near Mount Kailash showcased the ice blade's ruthlessness. When a Kashmiri force attacked a Tibetan caravan, the outnumbered defenders used the freezing temperatures to their advantage. As the Kashmirist swords grew notched and sluggish in the cold, Tibetan blades sliced cleanly through leather armor. Survivors described the weapons as ghost fangs that seemed immune to frost. Yet forging these blades demanded sacrifices. Smiths worked in sacred isolation, chanting mantras to ward off altitude sickness while enduring burns and frostbite. Some texts speak of snow-blind smiths who lost their sight to glare off the metal but could still judge a blade's temper by ear, listening for the resonant ping of a perfectly cooled sword. The finest weapons were said to bear ice veins, faint ripples in the steel that glowed blue when held to moonlight. Modern tests on surviving ice blades reveal their superiority. A 2021 study by the University of Lausanne found that Tibetan steel from the 8th century had corrosion resistance comparable to modern surgical stainless steel, unheard of for the era. Even today, high-altitude tribes in the Andes and Alps use similar ice tempering methods, proving the Tibetan's legacy endures wherever metal meets mountain. From chants that united minds to blades carved by glaciers, Tibetan warfare wasn't just about strength, it was about bending the very environment to their will. And as we'll see next, their mastery of terrain went far beyond weapons. While blades and brute force won battles, Tibet's true strength often lay in knowing the enemy's every move before they did. This brings us to the silent architects of victory, the Shadow Scouts. These elite operatives weren't just soldiers, they were masters of disappearance, slipping through enemy lines like mountain mist. Tibetan scouts trained from childhood in the art of Nanglan, or invisibility. Their regimen began with grueling high-altitude hikes, carrying nothing but a yak-hide satchel of tsampa and a hollowed gourd for water. For weeks, they'd traverse glaciers and cliffs, learning to move without disturbing so much as a pebble. The true test, crossing a valley floor strewn with dry branches in utter silence, fail, and you'd repeat the exercise blindfolded. Their camouflage was ingenious. Instead of bulky disguises, scouts draped themselves in Rajiapa patchwork cloaks woven from dyed yak wool that mimicked rock and scree. Up close, the fabric looked ordinary, but at a distance, it rendered the wearer nearly indistinguishable from the terrain. Some cloaks even incorporated local lichens or moss that grew naturally over time, making them live disguises. Tools were minimal but lethal. A curved Ferber dagger, its triple-edged blade designed for silent kills. A collapsible horn bow with arrows fletched with owl feathers for noiseless flights. Most crucially, they carried dry gum, enemy smoke, a paste of crushed medicinal herbs that masked human scent from tracker dogs. Ming Dynasty records tell of scouts infiltrating camps by rubbing the paste on their bodies and lying motionless among livestock for days. One declassified 8th century campaign near the Tsangpo River reveals their prowess. A Tang Dynasty force outnumbering Tibetans 3-1 camped by a gorge. For 5 nights, Shadow Scouts mapped every tent, counting footsteps between guard rotations. On the 6th night, they smeared grease on the enemy's pulley ropes for their water buckets. At dawn, the screech of failing pulleys masked Tibetan drum signals. By the time the Tang realized their buckets were sabotaged, ice melt had flooded the gorge, cutting off their retreat. Survival skills bordered on supernatural. Scouts could slow their heart rate to 1/3 its normal pace during stakeouts, a technique modern special forces call combat hibernation. They drank snowmelt through hollow bird bones to avoid leaving tracks at streams. Some texts even describe scouts swallowing charcoal to neutralize poison if captured, though this often proved fatal. Their legacy endures. The U.S. Army's Mountain Warfare School still teaches Tibetan-inspired concealment techniques, and the Rajiapa cloak's color theory influenced modern military ghillie suits. Yet perhaps their greatest weapon was patience. While other armies rushed to fight, Tibet's Shadow Scouts understood. Sometimes victory isn't about striking first, but seeing everything while remaining unseen. And speaking of unseen advantages, our next secret reveals how Tibetan armies turned faith into a weapon, using prayer flags not just for blessings, but as a battlefield communication system sharper than any blade. Now imagine turning one of the most docile creatures of the high plains into a weapon of mass disruption. That's exactly what Tibetan warriors did with their trusted yaks, animals so central to daily life that few expected them to become instruments of war. But when unleashed in a charging stampede, these shaggy beasts became avalanches of muscle and horn, capable of shattering enemy formations in moments. The logistics of a yak charge were as precise as they were brutal. First, handlers selected the most aggressive males, typically those already prone to territorial behavior during mating season. These animals were isolated for weeks, fed a diet of fermented barley to heighten their irritability. On the eve of battle, warriors would tie burning bundles of argy wormwood to their horns, the acrid smoke driving the yaks into a frenzy. Some accounts suggest handlers even rubbed chili paste into the animal's eyes, though this remains debated among historians. Timing was everything. The charge worked best in narrow valleys or mountain passes where enemies had little room to dodge. Scouts would position the herd uphill, often behind a thin screen of brush or rock. At the signal, usually the crack of a whip or a blown horn, handlers would release the yaks, sending hundreds of pounds of fury barreling downward at speeds exceeding 25 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Tang Dynasty records describe armored infantry tossed like straw dolls, while Mongol horses terrified by the yak's unfamiliar scent often bucked their riders in panic. But this tactic wasn't without risks. Yaks were valuable assets, and losing dozens in a single charge could cripple a village's livelihood. There were also accounts of stampedes backfiring, like the infamous Battle of Dromo Valley, where a sudden wind shift blew smoke back toward Tibetan lines, causing the herd to reverse course. Worse still, some enemies adapted. The Nanzhao kingdom began deploying teams of archers with fire arrows to turn the yaks prematurely, while the Uyghurs trained large Tibetan mastiffs to intercept and distract the charging animals. What made the yak charge truly ingenious was its psychological edge. To lowland armies, these hairy, snorting beasts seemed almost mythical, a far cry from the horses or elephants they understood. The sight of a wall of horns and flame charging through dust clouds broke morale as effectively as any sword strike. And when the chaos cleared, Tibetan cavalry would often sweep in to exploit the disarray, their mounts uniquely accustomed to navigating around fallen yaks. Modern militaries still study this tactic for unconventional warfare. During World War II, Soviet partisans reportedly attempted a modified yak charge against German supply lines in the Caucasus. More recently, survival experts have noted how Tibetan herders' deep understanding of animal behavior could inform riot control or crowd dispersal techniques. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson lies in the Tibetans' ability to weaponize the familiar, to look at a beast of burden and see hidden potential. As we've seen, warfare in the highlands often blurred the line between ingenuity and adaptation. But nothing blurred that line quite like our next secret, where faith and fabric intertwine to create a communication network visible across entire mountain ranges. Now, let's shift our gaze from the chaos of the battlefield to something seemingly peaceful, the vibrant prayer flags fluttering atop Himalayan peaks. What if I told you these sacred symbols of Tibetan Buddhism also served as a brilliant military communication network? The Tibetans mastered the art of turning the spiritual into the strategic. Prayer flags, traditionally inscribed with mantras to spread blessings on the wind, were repurposed to send silent orders across impossible terrain. Each color and pattern held a coded meaning. A blue flag with a white tapering vertical stripe, for instance, might signal enemy sighted to the west, while a red flag bearing a black swirling motif could warn of an impending ambush. What made this system revolutionary was its simplicity and range. Monasteries and watchtowers, already positioned on high ridges for spiritual reasons, became relay stations. A single flag change at one outpost would cascade down the mountain chain like dominoes, transmitting messages faster than any horseback courier. Historical accounts from the Yarlung dynasty describe entire troop movements coordinated this way during the annexation of Zhangzhung, with not a single spoken word to betray their plans. The flag's spiritual significance provided perfect camouflage. enemy scouts might dismiss them as mere religious objects, never suspecting that the sudden appearance of a yellow flag with intersecting triangles meant Tibetan archers were repositioning above their camp. Even if adversaries decoded the system, altering the flags risked provoking local communities a clever layer of cultural protection. Wind played a crucial role. Tibetans observed how different breeze patterns carried sounds and smells across valleys, timing their flag changes to moments when enemies were downwind and least alert. During the siege of Tsaparang, defenders used intermittent gusts to flicker specific flags, creating strobe-like effects that guided night attacks, a primitive form of visual Morse code centuries before its official invention. Modern cryptographers still marvel at the system's sophistication. Unlike smoke signals or drum beats, prayer flags required no fuel or noise, couldn't be intercepted by sound, and blended seamlessly into the environment. Special forces today study similar, passive signaling techniques for wilderness operations where electronic communication is compromised. But perhaps the most striking aspect was how it mirrored Tibetan philosophy, where nothing existed in isolation. A prayer for peace became a tool of war. The wind-carrying spiritual aspirations also carried battle orders. This duality sets the stage for our next revelation, where warriors didn't just manipulate the landscape, they weaponized sound itself. Now, let's step into the echoing heart of the Himalayas, where sound itself became a weapon. Imagine being an enemy soldier, trudging through a narrow valley, when suddenly the cliffs around you erupt with the clash of swords and war cries, except there's no one there. Tibetan warriors didn't just fight in these mountains, they became the mountains, using echoes to conjure phantom armies and turn the very landscape against their foes. This was the art of mountain echo tactics, a psychological masterpiece honed over centuries. The Himalayas, with their sheer cliffs and natural sound channels, acted like colossal amplifiers. Tibetan scouts would position small groups of warriors at precise points, often high ledges or canyon bends, where their shouts, drum beats, or even the clanging of metal would ricochet unpredictably. A single war horn blast could bounce between rock faces, morphing into what sounded like 100 horns closing in from all directions. Historical texts mention the Battle of Dromo, where a Tibetan force of barely 500 outmaneuvered an advancing army 3 times their size. As the enemy entered a valley, warriors hidden on opposing ridges timed their cries to create overlapping echoes, simulating the chaos of a massive ambush. Panicked, the invaders fractured into disorganized clusters, each convinced they were surrounded only to be picked off by archers concealed in the rocks. But the genius didn't stop at intimidation. Echoes also masked real movements. During nighttime raids, teams would clatter pots or drag chains near enemy camps, using the reverberations to cover the sound of approaching troops. In one account from the Tang dynasty, Tibetan raiders staged a ghost caravan by having horses with muffled hooves walk in circles behind a ridge, their neighs and wagon noises echoing as if a supply train stretched for miles. The ruse lured Tang scouts into a trap, leaving their main camp undefended. The tactics demanded meticulous knowledge of terrain. Warriors trained for years to memorize echo maps of key valleys, learning which angles produced the most convincing distortions. Some passes were so effective they earned names like Demon's Whisper Gorge or Liar's Canyon. Even the weather played a role. Cold, dense air at dawn carried sound farther, while midday heat could warp echoes into eerie, unfamiliar tones. Modern acoustics experts confirm the science behind these strategies. The Himalayas' unique geology creates sound mirrors, where certain frequencies bounce cleanly for miles. Tibetan warriors essentially crafted an early form of sonic camouflage, turning physics into fear. Special forces today study similar principles for urban warfare, using alleyways and buildings to misdirect enemies, proof that the mountain's ancient whispers still hold lessons for the battlefields of tomorrow. What makes this tactic chillingly brilliant is its simplicity. No elaborate technology, just an intimate understanding of nature's gifts. As we'll soon see, the Tibetans didn't just adapt to their environment. They weaponized every element, from the wind in the flags to the echoes in the stones. And next, we'll uncover how they turned even the deadliest terrain into an ally, the art of avalanche warfare. Now, let's shift our focus to a strategy that turned patience into a weapon, where victory came not from the clash of steel, but from the slow, relentless grip of starvation and cold. Tibetan commanders mastered the art of the bloodless siege, a brutal chess game where they let nature and logistics do the fighting for them. In the high Himalayas, supply lines were as fragile as ice. Tibetan armies would surround enemy forts or mountain passes, not with overwhelming force, but with silent, suffocating precision. They knew that in thin air and freezing temperatures, an army cut off from food and fuel would crumble faster than any wall. Historical records describe how they'd sabotage trails, poison wells, and even redirect glacial streams to deny water, turning besieged camps into frozen prisons. One of the most famous examples unfolded at the fortress of Jayantsi, when a much larger force of Nepalese warriors occupied the strategic stronghold. The Tibetans didn't storm the gates. Instead, they blocked every hidden goat path used by supply caravans and waited. Within weeks, the Nepalese, trapped without fuel for fires or fodder for their horses, began eating leather straps and saddle blankets. By the time winter storms sealed the mountain passes, they surrendered without a single major battle. But the real genius lay in timing. Tibetan scouts tracked weather patterns with near mystical accuracy, knowing exactly when blizzards or avalanches would isolate enemy positions. During the siege of Tsaparang, they lured a Tang dynasty battalion into a valley right before the autumn snows, then collapsed the only exit with carefully placed boulders. The Tang soldiers, buried under 10 feet of snow within days, had no choice but to negotiate. This strategy wasn't just about saving lives, it was cultural calculus. Tibetan Buddhism discouraged unnecessary killing, and commanders knew a bloodless victory often demoralized enemies more than a massacre. Survivors would spread tales of an enemy who didn't just defeat you but outthought you in your weakest moment. And as we'll see next, sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't a blade or a storm, but the very light of the sun itself, turned against eyes unprepared for the glare of the high peaks. Now we turn to a tactic that weaponized the very air itself, where the sun, usually a symbol of life, became a merciless ally. The snowblindness gambit was a brutal lesson in how Tibetan warriors exploited nature's most basic elements to cripple their foes. High-altitude sunlight in the Himalayas isn't just bright, it's lethal. At those elevations, UV rays slice through thin air unimpeded, and snow acts like a million mirrors, reflecting glare that can scorch retinas within hours. Lowland armies, unprepared for this onslaught, often stumbled blindly into ambushes. Tibetan warriors, however, had adapted over generations, their secret. A combination of biology and cunning. First, they trained their eyes. From childhood, Tibetan fighters practiced staring at distant mountain silhouettes at dawn and dusk, gradually building resistance to glare. Some accounts even mention herbal pastes rubbed around the eyes to reduce inflammation. But their real mastery lay in turning this natural advantage into a weapon. During the invasion attempts by the Tang dynasty in the 7th century, Tibetan forces employed polished copper shields not just for defense but as sunlight projectors. At high noon, entire units would angle these shields to focus beams directly into enemy lines. The effect was chaos soldiers clutching their faces, formations breaking as men collided with each other. Then came the arrows, loosed from ridges where the glare hid archers' positions. Timing was everything. Tibetan scouts tracked the sun's path like generals plotting troop movements. They knew precisely when sunlight would bounce off specific glaciers or lakes to blind key enemy positions. At the Battle of Dangxing, they waited until mid-morning when the sun aligned perfectly with a frozen river, then charged downhill with reflective Yak-Hide banners. The defending Turkic forces, squinting into what seemed like a wall of fire, never saw the spear thrusts coming, but perhaps the most ingenious application was psychological. Some warriors wore goggles made of smoked quartz or thin leather slits, not just for protection, but to appear inhuman. When Tang prisoners described facing demons whose eyes burned like the sun, morale crumbled faster than any fortification. This gambit reveals a deeper truth about Tibetan warfare. Every element of their harsh environment, even light itself, could be conscripted into service. And as we'll soon discover, their manipulation of perception didn't stop with the sun. Sometimes they conjured terrors straight from the spirit world. Shifting from the blinding glare of sunlight to the shadows of the mind, we uncover a tactic that preyed on primal terror. The spirit mask intimidation wasn't just about battle tactics, it was theater, designed to unravel enemy resolve before the first strike. Imagine facing a wall of warriors whose faces were twisted into the visages of wrathful deities, their expressions frozen in eternal fury. This was psychological warfare distilled to its purest form. Tibetan warriors didn't wear these masks casually. Each one was a masterpiece of sacred artistry, carved from lightweight wood or molded from layered leather, then painted with pigments mixed from minerals and crushed gemstones. The most fearsome designs drew inspiration from Buddhist protectors like Mahakala or Palden Lamo, deities whose grotesque features symbolized the destruction of ignorance and evil. Fanged mouths, bulging eyes, and flame-like hair weren't just decorations, they were weapons. Historical scrolls recovered from Lhasa monasteries describe how craftsmen consulted monks to ensure each mask's expression triggered deep, instinctive dread. Some even embedded animal teeth or mirrors in the eye sockets to catch flickering torchlight, creating the illusion of living, glowing eyes. The effect on unprepared enemies was catastrophic. During the Tibetan Empire's expansion into the Tarim Basin, Chinese chronicles tell of entire cavalry units fleeing at the sight of masked warriors emerging from mountain fog. The masks amplified the uncanny valley effect close enough to human to unsettle, but distorted enough to trigger primal alarm. Tibetan commanders exploited this by having masked troops chant in unison, their voices muffled and distorted by the mask's hollow interiors. To adversaries, it sounded like demons whispering in chorus. At the Siege of Khotan in 791, defenders reportedly abandoned their posts after night raids where masked warriors moved silently, their faces illuminated only by sporadic bursts of fire arrows. The psychological toll outweighed casualties tenfold, but the masks served a dual purpose for Tibetan warriors. Wearing them wasn't just about intimidation, it was a spiritual act. Before battles, monks would bless the masks, invoking the deities they represented. Warriors reported entering trance-like states, their fear suppressed by the belief they were vessels of divine wrath. This cultural layer made the tactic uniquely Tibetan. While other armies used frightening disguises, none tied them so deeply to religious identity. The masks became conduits between the earthly and the supernatural, a fact enemies came to dread. When Tang diplomats later wrote of soldiers who became demons at will, they weren't exaggerating. They were documenting a warfare tradition where perception and reality blurred. The legacy of these masks endures in Himalayan festivals today, where descendants of those warriors still dance in their ancestors' grimacing likenesses. It's a reminder that in Tibetan warfare, victory often belonged to those who could weaponize not just steel, but the human psyche itself. And as we'll see next, even their communication methods were designed to unsettle, turning prayer flags into a silent language of war. Moving from the psychological terror of spirit masks to the breathtaking precision of mounted combat, we arrive at one of Tibet's most lethal battlefield advantages, the mastery of horseback archery. While many cultures prized horse archers, none matched the Tibetans' ability to unleash deadly accuracy at full gallop across the Himalayas' brutal slopes. These warriors didn't just ride and shoot, they defied gravity, turning sheer cliffs and uneven ground into a tactical playground. Tibetan horse archers trained from childhood, forging an almost supernatural bond with their mounts. The sturdy Tibetan pony, bred for altitude and agility, could pivot on narrow ledges or charge downhill without stumbling, a feat impossible for bulkier steppe horses. But the real secret lay in the archer's unique stance. Unlike Mongol or Turkish riders who stood in stirrups for stability, Tibetan warriors mastered the art of shooting while seated, their legs wrapped tightly around the horse's barrel. This allowed them to absorb the animal's movement like a second skeleton, freeing their arms to draw and release with uncanny precision. Historical accounts from Tang Dynasty observers describe seeing Tibetan archers loose 3 arrows in the time it took a Chinese crossbowman to reload once, all while navigating slopes so steep their horses seemed to slide sideways. Their bows were equally extraordinary. Crafted from laminated bamboo and yak horn, these composite weapons were shorter than typical recurves, designed for quick maneuvering around rocks and trees. But their real innovation was the draw technique. Tibetan archers used a thumb lock method, curling their thumb around the string and locking it with a carved bone ring. This allowed faster releases and minimized string slippage in high winds, a common hazard at altitude. During the Tibetan Empire's raids into the Pamir Mountains, defenders reported arrows striking with enough force to pierce 2 men at once, a testament to the kinetic energy generated by downhill shots. The terrain itself became a weapon. Tibetan commanders exploited verticality, stationing archers on overlooking ridges where gravity amplified their arrows' range and penetration. At the Battle of Dafei River in 756, Tang troops found themselves bombarded by arrows arcing upward from hidden ravines, a disorienting tactic that shattered formations. Other accounts tell of archers triggering rock slides to funnel enemies into kill zones, then picking off survivors mid-chaos. What truly set them apart, though, was their cultural reverence for the bow. Tibetan Buddhism linked archery to spiritual discipline. Monks taught that focus during a shot could purify karma. Warriors practiced meditation alongside target drills, learning to steady their breath and quiet their minds amid galloping hooves. This fusion of skill and spirituality produced archers who could hit a moving target blindfolded, guided only by sound, a feat demonstrated in annual festivals to this day. The legacy of these mounted marksmen endures in Bhutan's Datsi competitions, where riders still gallop along cliffsides, loosing arrows at targets painted with demon faces. It's a vivid reminder that for Tibetan warriors, the bow wasn't just a tool of war. It was an extension of their identity, forged by the mountains themselves. And as we'll see next, even their food was engineered for conquest, with roasted barley flour fueling campaigns across impossible distances. Now, let's shift our focus from the battlefield to the very fuel that kept these warriors moving, because even the most skilled archer is useless without energy. Enter Tsampa, the roasted barley flour that became the unsung hero of Tibetan military campaigns. Picture this, an army maneuvering through the Himalayas, where supply lines are impossible and every ounce of weight matters. While other armies relied on cumbersome grain shipments or hunted game, Tibetan warriors carried their sustenance in simple leather pouches, turning mealtime into a tactical advantage. Tsampa wasn't just food, it was a logistical masterpiece. Lightweight and shelf-stable, a single bag could last for weeks without spoiling, even in freezing temperatures or driving rain. Warriors mixed it with butter tea or water to form dense, energy-packed dough balls, delivering a burst of calories in seconds. Unlike bread or rice, which required cooking, tsampa could be eaten on the move, mid-gallop, during a cliffside ambush, or while scaling a glacier. Historical records from the Tibetan Empire's expansion into Central Asia describe soldiers covering over 50 miles a day in thin mountain air, fueled by nothing but handfuls of this humble flour. The secret lay in its preparation. Barley was roasted before grinding, a process that not only preserved it but also broke down complex starches into easily digestible sugars. This gave warriors instant energy without the sluggishness of heavy meals critical for high-altitude combat where oxygen was scarce. Modern nutritionists have analyzed tsampa and found it remarkably balanced, high in fiber to stave off hunger, packed with B vitamins for stamina, and rich in amino acids to speed muscle recovery. It's no wonder Himalayan Sherpas still rely on it during Everest ascents today. But tsampa's brilliance extended beyond nutrition. Tibetan commanders used its efficiency to rewrite the rules of warfare. While enemy armies wasted time foraging or guarding supply trains, Tibetan forces moved like shadows, unshackled by logistics. During the invasion of the Tarim Basin in the 8th century, chroniclers noted how Tibetan troops outpaced Tang dynasty defenders by weeks, appearing as if conjured from the mountains themselves. Their secret, tsamba let them travel light and fast, striking before opponents could regroup. Cultural practices amplified its utility. Tibetan Buddhism intertwined food with spirituality, and warriors often blessed their tsampa before campaigns, reinforcing mental resilience. Some accounts even describe monks teaching soldiers to eat mindfully, turning each bite into a meditation, an early form of psychological conditioning. This discipline allowed warriors to endure grueling marches on minimal rations, their bodies and minds synchronized for endurance. The legacy of tsampa warfare lives on in unexpected places. Special forces today study Tibetan campaigns for insights into survival logistics, and NASA has experimented with barley-based space rations for long-duration missions. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions, a handful of flour, centuries of ingenuity, can outlast empires. And as we'll see next, even the mountains themselves became weapons in Tibet's arsenal, with avalanches unleashed as tools of war. Now, let's turn our attention from the warrior's ingenuity to the raw power of nature itself. Because the Tibetans didn't just fight with weapons, they weaponized the mountains. Imagine an enemy army trudging through a narrow Himalayan pass, confident in their numbers, when suddenly the very ground beneath their feet seems to roar. Avalanches, the deadliest force in high-altitude warfare, weren't just accidents to the Tibetans, they were a calculated strategy. This was avalanche warfare, a terrifying tactic where Tibetan forces used their intimate knowledge of the mountains to turn snow into a silent killer. Local herders who had spent generations observing wind patterns and snowpack stability became invaluable advisors to military commanders. They could pinpoint exactly where a single well-placed strike, a shout, an arrow, or even a drumbeat would trigger a catastrophic slide. Historical accounts from the Tibetan-Chinese Wars describe entire Tang dynasty regiments vanishing under walls of snow, their advance halted not by blades but by the environment itself. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its simplicity. Unlike conventional ambushes, avalanches left no survivors to counterattack and required no follow-up engagement. Tibetan scouts would identify enemy routes in advance, then wait for the perfect moment when fresh snowfall or rising temperatures made slopes unstable. Sometimes they'd even mimic animal calls to lure foes into pre-selected death zones. One 8th century chronicle recounts how a Tibetan unit disguised as shepherds led a Tang battalion into a valley, only to vanish moments before the mountainside collapsed upon them. The survivors, if any, faced hypothermia or starvation, while Tibetan warriors watched safely from distant ridges. But triggering an avalanche wasn't just about brute force, it demanded precision. Herders taught warriors to read the snow's layers like pages in a book. A brittle crust atop softer snow, ideal for a cascading collapse, wind-loaded cornices on a ridge. A single cut could send them crashing down. Tibetans also exploited sound's amplifying effect in thin mountain air, using drums or horns to vibrate unstable slopes. Modern glaciologists have confirmed these methods, noting how even small disturbances can unleash thousands of tons of snow at high altitudes. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical destruction. Enemy armies began fearing clear weather as much as blizzards, knowing sunny days could melt snow anchors. Tibetan shamans amplified this dread by claiming control over mountain spirits, staging rituals before battles to imply the avalanches were divine punishment. After a few such incidents, opposing forces would often refuse to advance through certain passes altogether. A victory without combat, avalanche warfare's legacy endures in surprising ways. Today, militaries study Tibetan tactics for modern applications, like using controlled slides to clear paths or block enemy movements. And in a twist of irony, Himalayan herders still share their ancestors' knowledge, not for war, but to protect climbers and trekkers from the same deadly forces. It's a reminder that in Tibet's arsenal, even the mountains bowed to human cunning. And speaking of nature's weapons, wait until you hear how they turn the night itself into an ally, with stars guiding their every move. Now, let's shift our gaze from the treacherous mountain slopes to the vast, star-filled skies above, because the Tibetans didn't just conquer the earth, they mastered the heavens. While most armies feared the darkness, Tibetan warriors turned it into their greatest weapon, using the stars as their map and the shadows as their cloak. This was celestial navigation, a skill so precise it allowed them to move like ghosts through the night, striking where and when they were least expected. In the thin air of the Himalayas, where clouds rarely obscure the sky, the stars burn brighter than anywhere else. Tibetan warriors, many of whom were nomadic herders before joining the military, grew up reading these celestial patterns like a language. They memorized the positions of key constellations, the Great Bear, the Pole Star, and the sprawling Milky Way, not just for direction, but to calculate time, distance, and even the changing seasons. Unlike lowland armies reliant on torches or moonlight, Tibetan units could traverse pitch-black terrain silently, guided solely by the heavens, but stars alone weren't enough. The true genius lay in combining celestial navigation with an intimate knowledge of mountain silhouettes. Tibetan scouts would study the jagged outlines of peaks against the night sky, using them as fixed reference points. A notch in a distant ridge, a lone pinnacle, or even the curve of a valley could serve as a landmark, allowing warriors to navigate complex terrain without a single misstep. Historical texts describe how Tibetan raiding parties would march for miles in total darkness, emerging suddenly behind enemy camps or atop strategic passes, positions their foes assumed were impossible to reach at night. One legendary account from the Tibetan Empire's expansion tells of a small strike force that crossed 50 miles of uncharted glacier by night, using the stars to maintain a straight path despite crevices and icefalls. At dawn, they appeared atop a cliff overlooking a Tang dynasty outpost, launching boulders and arrows before vanishing back into the shadows. The Tang soldiers, convinced they'd been attacked by mountain spirits, abandoned the post by morning. The Tibetans also exploited their enemies' reliance on visual cues. While opposing armies lit watchfires or clustered under lanterns, making themselves easy targets, Tibetan warriors trained their eyes to avoid artificial light, preserving their night vision. Some units even wore dark cloth over one eye during dusk, keeping it adapted to darkness for emergencies. This gave them a critical edge in ambushes where they could see clearly while their foes stumbled blindly. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this tactic was its psychological toll. After a few celestial-guided night attacks, enemy forces grew terrified of darkness itself. Sentries would mistake rustling winds for approaching armies or shoot arrows at shadows. Tibetan shamans amplified this fear, spreading tales of star demons guiding their warriors. By the time the enemy realized the truth, it was often too late. Their morale had already crumbled under the weight of the unknown. Even today, traces of this ancient wisdom endure. Modern mountaineers and special forces still study Tibetan night navigation techniques, particularly for operations without GPS. And in remote Himalayan villages, elders teach children to read the stars as their ancestors did, not for war but for survival. It's a reminder that for the Tibetans, the sky wasn't just a canopy. It was a battlefield, and speaking of battles, wait until you hear how they weaponized fire itself, not just for light, but as a messenger that could cross mountains in an instant. Now, let's turn our attention from the silent guidance of the stars to something far more explosive, because the Tibetans didn't just navigate the darkness, they set it on fire. Imagine standing guard in an enemy camp, peering into the inky black of a Himalayan night, when suddenly a streak of flames arcs across the sky. Before you can react, another follows, then another, a barrage of fireballs soaring over mountain peaks, too fast to intercept, too terrifying to ignore. This was no random act of arson. It was a calculated system of communication and terror perfected by Tibetan warriors, the fireball messengers. The technology behind these incendiary devices was deceptively simple yet devastatingly effective. Tibetan armies crafted fireballs from tightly wound bundles of yak wool soaked in animal fat or resin, then lit and launched using oversized slingshots or modified catapults. When hurled into the sky, these burning projectiles could travel astonishing distances, their arcs visible for miles in the thin mountain air. But these weren't just signals, they were weapons of fear. Enemy sentries would watch in horror as fireballs streaked overhead, never knowing if they marked an impending attack or were merely a distraction. Historical records from the Tang dynasty describe how Tibetan forces used fireballs to coordinate attacks across vast, impassable terrain. One unit would launch a sequence of flares, say, 2 quick bursts followed by a long arc, to signal allies hidden on the opposite side of a valley. The code was unintelligible to outsiders, allowing Tibetans to maneuver with perfect synchronization while their enemies scrambled in confusion. In one notorious siege, Tibetan warriors lit the night sky with a cascade of fireballs, convincing defenders that their camp was surrounded by thousands of troops. By dawn, the gates were abandoned only for the real army to emerge from an entirely different direction. The psychological impact was just as calculated as the tactical use. Fireballs often carried added horrors. Some were packed with sulfur to produce choking smoke, while others contained hollowed-out segments filled with shrieking metal bits that wailed like vengeful spirits as they flew. To superstitious enemies, these were omens of doom, proof that Tibetan forces had harnessed the wrath of mountain gods. Even seasoned soldiers would break ranks at the sound, believing no mortal army could command such infernal power. But perhaps the most ingenious application was the fireball's dual role as a tool of deception. Tibetan commanders would launch dummy signals in false patterns, tricking enemies into reinforcing the wrong mountain pass or exhausting their arrows on imaginary threats. Meanwhile, the real strike force would slip through undefended gaps, their path cleared by the chaos of misdirection. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, using spectacle to paralyze an opponent's mind before striking at their weakest point. The legacy of these fiery messengers lives on. Modern militaries still study their use of coded signals and psychological disruption, while Himalayan herders occasionally revive the technique during festivals, lighting the night with traditional fireballs as a tribute to their ancestors. It's a reminder that for the Tibetans, fire was more than a weapon, it was a language. And speaking of languages, wait until you hear how they turned prayer flags into a silent, sprawling communication network that could outmaneuver even the fastest horsemen. Now, let's shift from the fiery spectacle of communication to something far more intimate and deadly. High in the Himalayas, where narrow gorges split the mountains like cracks in the earth, Tibetan warriors turned simple rope bridges into instruments of carnage. Picture this: an enemy army, confident in their numbers, begins crossing a seemingly harmless bridge swaying over a 1,000-foot drop. Halfway across, the ropes suddenly shudder, not from the wind, but from hidden blades slicing through them like butter. This was the Bridge of Knives, a trap so ruthless it turned geography itself into an executioner. Tibetan defenders didn't just rely on strength to hold their territory, they weaponized the landscape. The bridges, woven from yak hair and hemp, appeared fragile but were deceptively sturdy until warriors tampered with them. Historical accounts describe how Tibetans embedded sharpened blades or saw-like tools into the ropes, often concealed by layers of woven fibers or dirt to avoid detection. When enemies were midway across, operatives hidden in nearby cliffs would yank release mechanisms, triggering the blades to sever key sections of the bridge. The result, entire squadrons would plummet into the abyss, their screams drowned by the roar of rivers below. One chilling legend from the 8th century tells of a Chinese general who led 500 soldiers across a bridge near modern-day Qinghai, only for the entire structure to collapse under them. Survivors claimed the ropes didn't break, they were cut with surgical precision. Tibetan scouts had spent weeks beforehand loosening strategic fibers, ensuring the bridge would fail at the worst possible moment. But the true genius lay in the aftermath. The same Tibetans would often rebuild the bridge within days, luring in fresh waves of unsuspecting enemies. The psychological toll was as calculated as the physical destruction. Crossing these bridges already required nerves of steel as they swung violently in the thin mountain air. Knowing they might be sabotaged turned every step into a gamble with death. Some invaders, paralyzed by fear, refused to advance while others rushed across in panic, only to be picked off by Tibetan archers waiting on the far side. The Bridge of Knives wasn't just a trap, it was a psychological chess move, forcing enemies to question every footfall, and the variations were endless. In some cases, Tibetans replaced entire rope segments with weaker materials that would snap under a certain weight, ensuring only small groups could cross safely before the bridge gave way. Other times, they left bridges intact but rigged hidden spikes to swing up from below, impaling climbers mid-step. The goal was never just to kill, it was to demoralize, to make every mountain pass feel like a death sentence. Modern engineers still marvel at the sophistication of these traps. Unlike European castle defenses, which relied on heavy fortifications, the Tibetan approach required minimal materials and maximal cunning. A single well-placed blade could achieve what an entire army might not, halting an invasion in its tracks. Even today, remnants of these sabotaged bridges survive in remote valleys, their frayed ropes whispering of the warriors who turned the very ground beneath their enemies' feet into a weapon. But if you think that's the pinnacle of Tibetan ingenuity, wait until you hear how they turned the most sacred of rituals, the sky burial, into a lethal deception. Now, just when you thought Tibetan warfare couldn't get more astonishing, let me introduce you to the human equivalent of a living telegram, the Lung Gam runners. These elite messengers weren't just fast, they were legendary endurance athletes capable of covering distances that would leave modern marathoners gasping. Imagine a single man sprinting across the roof of the world, scaling icy passes and rocky trails without stopping, all to deliver a critical message before the enemy even knew it was coming. This wasn't just speed, it was a superhuman feat of discipline and training. The Lung Gam runners were no ordinary couriers. They underwent years of brutal conditioning, starting as children, to master a unique running technique that combined controlled breathing, rhythmic strides, and an almost trance-like focus. Historical accounts describe their ability to traverse over 300 miles in a single day, a distance that would take horseback riders at least twice as long, especially in the treacherous Himalayan terrain. The secret, a combination of physical endurance and mental conditioning so intense that some runners reportedly entered a state where time and distance seemed to collapse around them. One of the most striking examples comes from the 19th century, when a Lung Gam runner was said to have carried a warning of an impending attack from Lhasa to a distant mountain garrison, normally a 10-day journey, in just under 36 hours. By the time the invaders arrived, the Tibetans were fully prepared, turning what should have been a surprise assault into a bloody defeat. The runners didn't just rely on raw speed. They memorized every shortcut, every hidden valley path, and even the most treacherous river crossings, making them immune to the obstacles that slowed conventional messengers. But how did they achieve such staggering feats? Training began with grueling ascents up high-altitude slopes, often while carrying heavy loads to build strength. Runners learned to synchronize their breathing with their footfalls, a practice said to conserve energy and maintain a steady pace for hours. Some texts even suggest they used specific mantras or visualizations to enter a meditative state, effectively disconnecting from physical exhaustion. And their diet packed with energy-dense foods like tsampa, roasted barley flour, and butter tea provided the fuel needed for these relentless journeys. The strategic impact of the Lungam runners can't be overstated. In an era without radios or telegraphs, information was power, and Tibet's ability to move messages faster than anyone else gave them a critical edge. Commanders could coordinate defenses across vast distances, outmaneuvering enemies who were left relying on sluggish, traditional messengers. Even more impressive, the runners often traveled at night, using the stars and mountain silhouettes to navigate, making them nearly invisible to enemy scouts. Yet what's truly fascinating is how these runners blurred the line between warrior and monk. Many were deeply spiritual, viewing their endurance as a form of moving meditation. Some accounts claim the most skilled could run across snow without leaving footprints, a detail that's likely metaphorical but speaks to the awe they inspired. Even today, traces of their legacy survive in the ultra-distance runners of the Himalayas, who still use some of the same breathing and pacing techniques. So the next time you hear about a modern athlete breaking an endurance record, remember, the Lungam runners were doing it centuries ago without GPS or energy gels, just sheer willpower and an intimate bond with the mountains. And if you think that's the pinnacle of Tibetan ingenuity, wait until you hear how they weaponized something as solemn as a funeral rite. Now, shifting our gaze to the flickering shadows of the Himalayas, we uncover one of Tibet's most cunning illusions, the ghost campfires. Picture this, an enemy army, cold and wary, scanning the darkness for signs of Tibetan forces, only to spot dozens of fires scattered across the mountainside. But here's the twist, most of those flames were nothing but decoys, carefully staged to manipulate perception and lure foes into fatal miscalculations. This tactic wasn't just random deception, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Tibetan commanders, often outnumbered, needed every advantage to level the playing field. Borrowing from the wisdom of nomadic herders who used fires to ward off predators, they adapted the concept for battle. By lighting clusters of small, controlled flames in strategic locations, some close, some impossibly far apart, they created the illusion of a vast, sprawling army. Enemy scouts would report back in panic, convinced they faced overwhelming numbers, when in reality, the Tibetans might be a fraction of that size. The execution was as meticulous as it was brilliant. Genuine campfires were kept minimal and hidden, while decoys were designed to mimic the real thing. Warriors used dried yak dung, a slow-burning fuel, to ensure the fires lasted through the night without requiring constant tending. They'd even scatter abandoned gear or footprints near the decoys to sell the illusion. In one recorded clash during the 17th century, a Tibetan force of just 500 men duped an invading army of thousands into retreating without a single arrow, loosed simply by lighting ghost fires along a 3-mile stretch of valley. But the genius didn't stop at intimidation. Ghost campfires also served as bait. In some battles, Tibetans would leave a few real fires unattended, luring enemy raiding parties into ambushes. Others used the decoys to mask their movements, slipping away under cover of night while their adversaries remained fixated on the false signals. The tactic played on human nature, the tendency to fear the unknown and overestimate threats in the dark. What's fascinating is how this mirrored Tibet's broader philosophy of warfare. Win through wit, not just strength. The same nomads who inspired the tactic also taught Tibetans to read the land like a map, knowing where echoes carried, how mist distorted sound, and where moonlight could betray movement. Ghost campfires weren't just tricks, they were a testament to the deep relationship between the people and their environment, and the legacy lives on. Modern militaries still study these principles, using thermal decoys and electronic warfare to replicate what Tibetans achieved with yak dung and ingenuity. So the next time you hear about dummy targets in combat, remember the masters of the art weren't in a high-tech lab, but high in the Himalayas, turning firelight into a weapon of the mind. And speaking of weapons, wait until you see how they transformed something as serene as prayer flags into a battlefield communication network. Now, let's step into the blinding glare of the Himalayas, where Tibetan warriors turned sunlight itself into a weapon. Imagine facing an enemy who didn't just wield swords or arrows, but harnessed the very elements against you. This was the power of the ice mirror shields, a dazzling and ruthless tactic that left foes disoriented and vulnerable at the most crucial moments of battle. The concept was as simple as it was devastating. Tibetan fighters crafted shields from ice, carefully polished to a glass-like finish. These weren't just defensive tools, they were optical weapons. When angled correctly, the shields could reflect the intense high-altitude sunlight directly into enemies' eyes, creating a strobe-like effect that disrupted vision and caused temporary blindness. In the thin air of the Himalayas, where sunlight is harsher and glare more intense, the impact was magnified. A well-timed flash could leave an entire front line squinting, stumbling, or even dropping their weapons in confusion, just as Tibetan warriors closed in for the attack. But crafting these shields wasn't as straightforward as freezing water. Artisans selected ice from specific high-altitude lakes, renowned for their clarity and density. The ice was then slowly polished with smooth stones and animal fats to remove imperfections, creating a surface as reflective as modern glass. Some shields were even reinforced with woven bamboo or yak-hide backings to prevent shattering during combat. Historical accounts describe how, on clear mornings, Tibetan units would test their shields by signaling to one another across valleys, practicing the precise angles needed to maximize glare. The tactical applications were ingenious. During the Battle of the Silver Pass in the 16th century, a Tibetan outpost used ice mirrors to blind an advancing Mongol cavalry unit, causing horses to panic and throw riders as they charged. In another clash, defenders on a mountain ridge synchronized their shields to create a continuous wall of reflected light, forcing enemy archers to fire blindly, their arrows falling harmlessly off target. The shields also played a psychological role. The sudden, unnerving flashes were often misinterpreted as Chinese letter, sowing superstition and fear. What's remarkable is how this tactic exploited the environment. Tibetan warriors understood that high-altitude sunlight behaved differently. It was sharper, more concentrated, and could be weaponized in ways impossible at lower elevations. They also timed their attacks for mid-morning or late afternoon, when the sun's angle was ideal for reflection. And because the shields were made of ice, they left no trace after melting, adding to the mystique of these ghost weapons that seemed to appear and vanish at will. Modern parallels exist too. Today, military and law enforcement use strobe lights and reflective devices for crowd control or disorientation. But centuries before lasers or flashbangs, Tibetan warriors were manipulating light with nothing more than ice and ingenuity. It's a reminder that sometimes the most advanced weapons aren't forged in fire but frozen in it. And speaking of frozen ingenuity, wait until you hear how they turned avalanches into a deliberate instrument of war. Now let's descend from the blinding glare of ice mirrors into the eerie shadows of psychological warfare, where Tibetan warriors weaponized fear itself. Few tactics were as unsettling or as effective as the demon-summoning ruse, a carefully orchestrated deception that preyed on an enemy's deepest superstitions. Picture this: under the flickering light of torches, shamans in grotesque masks chant in tongues, their voices echoing through mountain passes as smoke swirls around them. To invading armies, it wasn't just a performance, it was proof that supernatural forces had been unleashed against them. The brilliance of this ruse lay in its simplicity. Tibetan commanders knew that many of their adversaries, from Mongol horsemen to Chinese infantry, held deep-seated beliefs in spirits and omens, so they staged elaborate rituals before key battles, complete with masked dancers, bone trumpets, and magic fires that burned unnaturally bright thanks to hidden salts or minerals. Some accounts describe shamans hurling bundles of smoldering herbs that produced hallucinogenic smoke, disorienting enemies who inhaled it. Others tell of warriors hidden in the cliffs above, manipulating puppets or flags to create the illusion of spectral figures moving through the mist. The goal wasn't just to frighten, it was to trigger mass panic. One of the most infamous uses of this tactic occurred during the siege of Red Valley in the late 14th century. A vastly outnumbered Tibetan garrison faced a Tangut army that outgunned them 10-1. Rather than meet them head-on, the Tibetans staged a nighttime ritual on the valley floor. As the Tangut forces advanced, they witnessed robed figures summoning a swirling vortex of flames, actually just pitch-soaked rags spun on ropes, while masked warriors emitted unearthly wails through hollow horns. Convinced they were facing demonic intervention, the Tangut vanguard broke ranks and fled, trampling their own reinforcements in the chaos. By sunrise, the entire army had retreated, leaving behind weapons and supplies. But the demon summoning ruse wasn't just about props and theatrics. It relied on meticulous timing and cultural intelligence. Tibetan scouts would often infiltrate enemy camps beforehand, spreading rumors of cursed battlefields or ghostly omens. The rituals themselves were timed to coincide with natural phenomena, a sudden gust of wind, an eclipse, or the eerie howls of Himalayan wolves, to amplify the effect. Even the choice of masks mattered. Some were modeled after wrathful Buddhist deities, while others resembled local folk demons, tailored to the specific fears of the opposing force. What makes this tactic so fascinating is its dual edge. While it exploited enemy superstitions, it also played on the Tibetan warriors' own spiritual framework. Many believed their shamans genuinely channeled protective spirits, turning the ruse into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Modern military historians compare it to psychological operations units that use sound cannons or holograms to disorient foes. But for the Tibetans, the real weapon wasn't smoke or masks. It was the universal human instinct to fear the unknown. And as we'll see next, sometimes the most terrifying unknowns weren't supernatural but all too human. While supernatural fears could scatter entire armies, the Tibetans understood that sometimes the most devastating blows came from a single blade in the shadows. Moving from the spectacle of demonic illusions to the chilling precision of covert operations, we encounter the silent killers, elite assassins who turned stealth into an art form. These weren't ordinary soldiers but specialists trained to slip past defenses, strike without warning, and vanish like mountain mist. Disguise was their first weapon. Many operated under the unassuming guise of traveling monks, their robes hiding razor-sharp daggers forged from rare Himalayan metals. Others posed as merchants, their caravans laden with goods and concealed poison vials. The best-known cases involve assassins infiltrating enemy camps as medics, exploiting trust to administer lethal remedies or strike during medical examinations. Historical accounts describe targets dying mysteriously in their sleep, their guards finding no signs of struggle, just a single, almost surgical wound. Training for these operatives was grueling. Candidates were selected young, often from nomadic clans with intimate knowledge of high-altitude terrain. They mastered the art of moving silently across loose scree slopes, using yak wool wrappings to muffle footsteps. Some could hold their breath for minutes, a skill honed by diving into glacial lakes to retrieve weighted stones. Their most feared technique involved a specialized dagger called the ferber, a triple-edged blade designed to puncture armor with minimal resistance. Unlike broader swords, it left wounds that barely bled externally, making kills harder to detect. One notorious operation occurred during a Tibetan rebellion against the Tang dynasty. A silent killer infiltrated a Chinese commander's tent by posing as a scribe, exploiting the man's habit of working late with only scholars present. The assassin used a needle dipped in aconite, a poison derived from local wolfsbane hidden in a scroll's dowel. When the commander unrolled it, he pricked his finger and died within hours, his symptoms dismissed as altitude sickness. By the time the Tang realized foul play was involved, the assassin had already melted into a pilgrim group crossing into Nepal. What set these killers apart wasn't just their methods but their psychological impact. Unlike the terror of mass demon summoning, their work sowed paranoia. Enemy leaders would purge their own ranks, suspecting spies everywhere. Some Tibetan texts even reference assassins deliberately leaving subtle clues, a misplaced prayer bead, a footprint too small for a soldier, to amplify this unease. Modern special forces still study these tactics, particularly how Tibetans exploited cultural norms like hospitality or religious reverence to bypass security. Yet the silent killer's legacy is more than historical intrigue. Their existence reminds us that in Tibet's military playbook, victory wasn't always about overwhelming force. Sometimes it hinged on the right person in the right place, with a blade sharp enough to change the course of a war without anyone ever hearing it unsheathed. And as we'll see in our final secret, when all else failed, Tibet's warriors had one last doctrine that made them legends even in defeat. But when stealth and deception reached their limits, when the enemy stood at the gates with overwhelming force, Tibet's warriors turned to their most unshakable principle, a doctrine etched not in tactics but in spirit. The last stand wasn't merely a battle strategy, it was a calculated act of defiance, transforming certain death into an immortal legacy. Unlike the sacrificial charges of other cultures, Tibetan last stands were deliberate psychological warfare. Commanders would choose terrain where retreat was impossible, narrow mountain passes, crumbling cliffs forcing their outnumbered troops to fight with their backs to the void. Historical scrolls describe warriors painting their faces with ritual colors, chanting prayers to wrathful deities as they advanced to enemies. These weren't desperate men, but avatars of vengeance who had already embraced the afterlife. The effect was paralyzing. A Tang dynasty chronicle recounts how just 300 Tibetans held a pass against 2,000 Chinese soldiers for 3 days, their corpses found stacked like a wall, weapons still clutched in frozen hands. The survivors who retreated spoke of demons who laughed as they bled. This philosophy stemmed from Tibet's unique blend of Buddhism and warrior culture. Soldiers believed dying in defense of their homeland guaranteed rebirth in a sacred realm, but there was cold pragmatism too. A single last stand could deter future invasions for generations. After the massacre of a Tibetan garrison at Dardo Pass in the 8th century, local nomads spread tales of the dead warriors' spirits haunting the cliffs. For over a century, no invading army dared take that route, fearing supernatural retribution. The doctrine's most chilling refinement was the Mi-La fire god ritual. Cornered units would douse themselves in yak butter and set themselves alight, charging engulfed in flames. A Mongol general's diary describes such an attack during Kublai Khan's invasions. They came like moving bonfires, arrows passing through them as if they were already ghosts. My horses panicked, trampling our own men. Even in annihilation, Tibetans weaponized their deaths. Modern militaries still study these events. The Taiwanese Special Forces Guardian Rock training, where commandos defend isolated positions to the last bullet, draws directly from Tibetan last stand. But perhaps the doctrine's true power lay in how it reshaped history's narrative. To lose a battle was inevitable. To choose how you fell eyes open, singing battle hymns, that was victory distilled to its purest form. And so we close our journey through Tibet's military secrets not with a technique but a question. When the only choices are how you fight or how you die, which legacy would you leave? As we bring this journey through Tibet's ancient warfare secrets to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on the breathtaking ingenuity these warriors displayed. From the whispering arrows that shattered enemy morale to the frozen river ambushes that turned nature into a weapon, each tactic was a masterpiece of adaptation. The Tibetan Highlanders didn't just fight their enemies, they outthought them, using every inch of their brutal environment to their advantage. The Yak-Hide Armor, the phantom horsemen, the avalanche warfare, these weren't just tricks. They were survival strategies honed over centuries in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. What's truly remarkable is how these techniques interwove the spiritual with the strategic. The thunder drums weren't just instruments of war, they were sacred objects, their echoes believed to summon divine protection. The mantra warfare synchronized soldiers' movements while connecting them to something transcendent. Even the last stand doctrine, as devastating as it was, carried the weight of a spiritual promise. This wasn't just a culture that mastered combat, it was a civilization that understood war as an extension of its deepest beliefs. Now here's the question that lingers after uncovering all 30 secrets. Could these ancient methods still hold power today? Some, like the high-altitude conditioning or the psychological terror of the spirit masks, have already inspired modern special forces training. Others, like the poisoned wind or the sky burial deception, remain ethically fraught. But the core lessons, adaptability, psychological dominance, and leveraging terrain are timeless. Imagine if today's military strategists combined drone technology with the Mirage Camouflage tactics, or used modern materials to recreate the ice mirror shields. The possibilities are as vast as the Himalayas themselves. Before we part ways, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which of these 30 secrets fascinated you the most? Could you see any of them being adapted for contemporary warfare? Drop your answers in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you're hungry for more unraveled mysteries of history, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. There are countless more hidden strategies, forgotten battles, and untold stories waiting to be explored, and I'd love for you to join me for the next adventure. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't swords or arrows, but the unbreakable spirit of those who wield them.